Hi friends, today is the 29th of May 2021 and last evening we had an amazing session with Juanita Roberson, who is an expert in grief and grieving and reconciliation. And Vijay and I, since we are both life partners as well as work partners, we often have these breakfast conversations, and I often wish I could press record at that moment because there is so much that we process when we go through these things. So I really thought today's conversation needs to be recorded. So thanks, Vijay, for agreeing to come on this Zoom recording and turning this Shakti dialogue into a Shiva Shakti dialogue, you know, with a masculine and feminine perspective, perhaps, to grieving. But with that, let's dive right in. What was it like for you yesterday? What were the key takeaways from Juanita's session on healing organizational grief?
I really enjoyed the overall session. It was a 2-hour session and 2 hours flew by because it was very interactive. There were breakouts and one could get a chance to actually hear and share with quite a few others. So I think I got quite a lot out of it. If I were to summarize my top 3 learnings or insights, the first was the idea that grieving is not so much about sadness or sorrow, but that it's about the release of sadness and sorrow. And therefore that release component and how to enable that release was a good insight for me. Again, it reminded me of the kind of things that we do in our cancer coaching work on the topic of death and loss, and the idea of processing and letting go that sorrow and that shock. The second thing that struck me was when she talked about the different levels of grief. There is the egocentric or the personal one. There is the ethnocentric or the collective one. And then there is the world-centric, which is kind of the biggest, broadest planetary kind of thing. And what I found interesting, if, for example, I take the frame of the current pandemic, then I can see how this pandemic is creating grief at all 3 levels. It's creating grief at the personal level in terms of people who have suffered or people who have passed away, who are close to us. It's creating a collective grief in our society, in the nation, in our organizations, and that has a slightly different dimension to it. And clearly it has created a great deal of grief at the planetary level, where our whole sense of humanity and our existence as a species is being confronted. And, you know, we're all grieving the loss of what we had thought or what we had thought might be. So I really liked those 3 levels. And it strikes me that if you have to process grief at these 3 different levels, then we have to understand it and address it differently. The same methodology may not work at all 3 levels. That was the second thing. And the third thing was the whole idea of, you know, what's the relationship with grief? And it's something that I've been thinking about, and even in our breakouts, we had a nice conversation about the idea that grief itself is our relationship with reality. And so how can we really understand, you know, what that relationship really means? And I'd like to certainly explore that further. So these were my 3 big takeaways.
Thanks, Vijay. And since you've summed it up so beautifully, I'll just add my voice. You know, my main takeaway was building on this idea of grief being something you have to get into relationship with. And Samata Vashisht summarized it so well. She said, grief is the backdrop of our life, you know. So, you know, if grief is a fellow traveler with us in life, then it is good to be in relationship with it, you know, get to know it, walk with it. instead of avoiding it or suppressing it or pretending it is not there. So to befriend grief in order to walk together for our mutual liberation, and from a suffering closed heart to one that is broken open to the flow of compassion. This is broadly my takeaway, and I just went to bed really working with this, woke up in the morning with this wonderful song in my head, which we'll talk about later. But let's get into the second part of what we want to quickly cover today. The big hook and the theme of yesterday's session was the concept of organizational grief. And that was very intriguing for many of us. So I'm curious, what is your takeaway on organizational grief?
Yeah, that was also my primary motivation for joining yesterday's session, because it is something that I sense and something that is intriguing and something that deserves to be explored further and a little more deeply. So my understanding of it is, first of all, of course, it's in that middle level, that ethnocentric level. And so the question that is running through my mind is that it is not just about personal grief in an organizational context. Then it would still be personal grief, but in an organizational context. So my understanding is that organizational grief assumes that the organization itself is a living entity. It's an organism, in other words. And that living entity experiences grief like other living entities experience grief. This is extremely interesting, that if you think of an organization as a living, intelligent, complex system or entity, then how does an organization grieve? What are the stimulus that releases grief in an organization? And how can leaders of that organization help that organization to process that grief? So I think for me, that is certainly an interesting point. If I were to think of examples of what I'm saying in my long career, I have seen organizations go through multiple transitions. And I have done a lot of work with organizational transitions as a transitions coach. And in a way, my feeling is that when one is looking at the transitions of an organization, perhaps we haven't paid enough attention to this idea of organizational grief as it goes through those transitions. And how can we actually start to think of examples? So, to give you some instances, let us say that I've been involved with organizations that have been taken over or merged with other organizations. And then the organization that has been taken over has lost its name, has lost its logo, has lost its branding, has lost its culture, has lost its leaders, and is now suddenly expected to be part of another organization and suddenly become somebody else. Now, imagine if this had happened to an individual, how much grief there would be. And then if it happens to an organization, how much grief there is and how do we address that grief? So that is one example. Another example might be that, let us say, an organization decides to grow and expand and go into new categories or go into new markets, which it has never been in before. And suddenly people are now faced with a completely different context, a completely different culture, a completely different environment. And that is again going to shake one's moorings that one has as an organization. And perhaps there is grief there. A third example might be, for example, that, we've had the Me Too crisis. And if you look at the impact of the Me Too crisis, not only on the people who were directly involved, but the larger group of people, then again, it is going to lead to a tremendous sense of discomfort and a tremendous vacuum and a tremendous level of questioning and processing and making meaning, which perhaps has not been done at an organizational level. So when I think about these kinds of big wrenching change or transitions that take place, I feel as if the idea of organizational grief really needs to be explored and taken forward.
Yes, this reminds me of, when I was working with ESPN Star Sports, I was brought in as head of corporate communications just as these two entities merged. So ESPN was a Disney owned company. Star Sports was a Rupert Murdoch News Corp owned company. And because they were both in Asia and they ended up competing for the rights of these big sporting properties, it just made sense to just merge. But being head of corporate communications, I also had to handle the internal communications and the culture and the way in which these two teams learned to gel and work together. So when Juanita talked about at that second ethnocentric level, if you don't process grief, it expresses as rage. And now when I look back and I see the incredible pain and conflict that would happen between the leaders and, just even people down the line, I realized that's what it was. It was unprocessed grief. So
similarly, if you look at the pandemic right now, the pandemic is forcing so many organizations to fundamentally alter their business models. Now, altering your business model might just sound like some quick mechanical activity, but it's not. It's intrinsic to the identity and it's intrinsic to the nature of that organization. So if you're going to shift your business model, and if you're going to let go of something that you've done successfully in the past, it is going to create, in my view, a great sense of grief. And therefore, the pandemic is an opportunity to examine organizational grief in a different context right now.
Great. So moving on to the third thing we wanted to bring up in this conversation is how can we zoom out with these ideas that we heard yesterday and processed yesterday and kind of make larger meaning and purpose from it. So using the Shakti leadership lens, where I work with archetypal psychology, understanding psychology, mythology as psychology. So since yesterday's session was really meant for helping corporate India and workplaces in India make sense of the grief that's going, that's rampant there right now, I said, how can we look into our own Indic wisdom and philosophy and see what comes up that we can refer to that can be a reference point. So, for example, this whole idea of shok and ashok, shok is grief or sadness, and ashok is the absence of grief and therefore happiness. And this polarity or duality of shok and ashok, both coexisting as polarities that we have to learn to live with and navigate in life. So in a way, if you look at the archetype of the Buddha and Shiva, how do we reconcile the Buddha and Shiva in the Indic psyche? So I know you have a very strong basis in Buddhist philosophy in your own spiritual practice, Vijay. So how do we look at a psycho-spiritual approach to grieving fully? For me, maybe the Buddha approach is the first noble truth is dukkha, our conditioned reality, which is, samsara, and it is based in a way impermanence and therefore brings up constant suffering. And then, so in a way, I think that's a very good psychological perspective or frame that can help us. And then a spiritual frame is the Shiva philosophy that, Ananda is our essential nature, that we are made up of bliss. As, one of Swami Bodhananda's recent quotes, our scriptures emphatically say that happiness is our essential nature. And the mantra Shivoham, I am Shiva, is a bold and unequivocal declaration of that truth. I am happiness, period. Right? This is from his book, Leadership Excellence and the Power of Soft Skills. So do you want to speak to the concept of a psycho-spiritual approach to grieving, Vijay?
Yeah, I think it's very important that we do, because again, as Juanita said yesterday, we are first given the opportunity to process grief at the spiritual level, then at the emotional level, and then at the physical level. So if we don't cover the psycho-spiritual part, then we have not really done justice to that insight of hers. So I think it's important that we do that.
But coming back to, or just closing perhaps, this idea, just making it very real and not being so theoretical, having gone through a lot of grief and loss in our own lives, my experience is, and then maybe there is also a way in which people who are dominant masculine in their personality, maybe they process grief in a particular way. And those who are dominant feminine in their personality, they process grief in a different way. So that was a new aha that came up for me just based on the conversation you and I had. Like, I experienced yesterday's session quite differently from the way you did. And so for me, maybe it is a feminine path, which is the path of letting your heart break open. And so the way I saw the journey is, it's like in our book, My Cancer Is Me, we say the journey from illness to wholeness. It's always a journey. So for me, this is like the journey from suffering to compassion through grieving, right? That grieving gives us this incredible opportunity to befriend it and make it a fellow traveler on the path that takes us from a contracted heart place, which is effectively what suffering is. And if we allow grief to move through us and wash through us, and we don't deny it, then somehow it kind of moistens and softens open the heart, and grieving and grief becomes the medicine that cracks the closed heart open. And then what comes out of it is this huge wave of karuna. And, you know, then I remembered that in Buddhism, the final attainment is a state of mahakaruna, right? So you just feel this incredible, in fact, sometimes it's like, how much compassion can you bear? That is the feeling you get. Your heart just breaks open and you just feel so much, you feel so full that you feel you will burst with it. You know, so even that requires a kind of stepping back and saying, okay, let me take even compassion one bite at a time. You know, let my heart expand in steps, because it may not be able to contain so much compassion that comes out when you walk through grief. You know, so for me, grief just now feels not like something I will avoid, but I have a new respect for it. I have a sense of wanting to enter into relationship with it. And I've come away from yesterday's call realizing there are so many episodes in my life, professionally and personally, that, you know, you just put on your hero mantle and you get on with coping, you know. And you and I have done a lot of that since your cancer diagnosis. And then you realize we have lots of tick marks of success, but somewhere we may not have paused long enough to process the grief. And now I'm looking at it like not something to avoid, but an opportunity to go back into and say, it has gifts for us, as Juanita said. And, you know, I was in one of the breakouts with Ria D'Souza, and she was saying for her relationship with grief is like the relationship with garbage. You know, you have to compost it. And you've got to go back into it and you've got to kind of recycle it and air it and ventilate it until it turns into compost, and then fertilizer, you know, kind of makes you grow more beautiful things. So yeah, I think that's where I'm ending this, this experience at this point. What about you?
I think I just want to highlight what you started this segment by saying, which is that perhaps masculine and feminine process grief differently. I think there is some truth to that. In fact, I would say that probably all 9 of the Enneagram types probably process grief in their own ways, because of our conditioning and because of how we deal with reality, etc. And so, particularly when we are looking at organizations and when we are going into organizations with this idea of organizational grief, I think we have to let go the idea that everybody must process it pretty much in the same way by breaking down and crying, for example.
Good point.
Right? So if somebody has lost a person, then their expression of that grief might be breaking down and crying. And again, as Gauri said, in the Indian tradition, we have the Rudali concept, which is, you bring in somebody from the outside to open the tap of those tears. But it's not necessary that when we are dealing with other kinds of grief and other kinds of loss, that the expression or the manifestation will be the same. And so somebody may feel grief very deeply, but may not cry. And so we should not make crying a proxy for grief. Similarly, somebody may feel grief very deeply, but may turn inwards. And we should not make an outward expression a proxy for grief. And so I think where I came out was really to explore that nuance which Juanita talked about between grief that we perceive and the act of grieving, and the way that expresses itself may also be slightly different. It may be different at each of those different levels. And therefore, we have to be quite careful and sensitive in terms of how we process it. So yeah, to me, that was the big insight when it comes to helping organizations deal with their organization's grief.
Great point, Vijay. And I think that's a good place to stop this. And I would only say TBC, to be continued.
And once again, big thanks to Juanita for a wonderful session yesterday, and to all the participants who were very open, very engaged, and very authentic. So it was a great session.
Yes, and I just want to also place here, if people have enjoyed this, then we may want to do a follow-up, which is also to our dialoguing death session a year ago, and now the session that Juanita did. Maybe we could do one on befriending grief and the different ways in which one can do that. So
yeah, why not?
Yeah. All right. Thanks,
okay.
Mr. Bhat.
Bye. Thank you, ma'am.